The dimly lit cantina echoes, tucked away in the periphery of a desolate asteroid, hummed with the voices of the cruelest and the most cunning folk the galaxy had ever choked on. Scattered hollow light danced across their scarred faces and venomous smiles, revealing the murkier aspects of humanity that few dared to confess. "Your drink, sir," murmured the bartender, sliding an indigo-colored concoction across the counter to its anonymous recipient. Slumped over the counter, a woman with fiery red hair and a cybernetic eye skewered the man sitting next to her with a glassy, calculating stare. Her gaze held the brutality of her experiences and the cunning of her profession. You wouldn't want to cross her. Many had tried and failed. "You know, Bronn," she muttered, her voice thick with smoke and pain, "there's an old saying on Mars. Trust is as rare as a solar eclipse." Bronn, a wiry man with an oily beard, sneered, a twinkle of mischief buried within his hardened gaze. He took a sip from his drink, his throat muscles clenching as the liquid burned its way down. He leaned in close and whispered, "They say that about trust, do they, Lira? Ah, well." He paused, the air tingling with tension. "Mars has 2 moons, eh?" Lyra's grip on her glass tightened, her knuckles turning white. She knew all too well what Bronn was implying. Mars had 2 moons, but only one was visible from the cantina Echoes, Deimos. The other moon, Phobos, was hidden behind the asteroid. "What are you suggesting?" Lira asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Bronn leaned even closer and lowered his voice to a whisper. "I'm suggesting we take advantage of this rare opportunity," he said with a sly grin. "You see, I happen to know someone who's looking for a crew to help him retrieve something valuable from Phobos." Lira raised an eyebrow skeptically. "And why should I trust you? You've double-crossed me before." Bronn chuckled and took another sip of his drink. "Because this time it's not just me making the offer." He gestured towards the entrance of the cantina where a tall figure in a long coat stood waiting. Lira squinted, trying to make out the figure in the shadows. As he stepped forward, she could see that he was wearing a hood that covered most of his face. He approached their table with slow and deliberate steps. Bronn stood up to greet him, a smug grin on his face. "I see you got my message," he said. The hooded figure nodded silently before turning his attention to Lira. "Ms. Valtor," he said in a deep voice that sent shivers down her spine. "My name is Kaiden Blackwell, and I have a proposition for you." Lira eyed him warily but motioned for him to continue. "I need someone with your particular set of skills to help me retrieve an artifact from Phobos," Kaiden explained, his eyes piercing through hers as if trying to read her thoughts. "And what's in it for me?" Lira asked, leaning back in her chair. Kaiden reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small data chip which he slid across the table towards her. "Everything you need to know about this mission is on there," he said simply. Lyra's fingers hovered over the data chip, her mind racing. She had been in too many situations like this before, where one wrong move could lead to her downfall. But the lure of Phobos, a forbidden moon holding untold secrets, gnawed at her. "What makes you think I'll survive this one, Blackwell?" she asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. Kaiden's face remained stoic, the shadows concealing any hint of emotion. "Because, Lira," he replied softly, "this isn't just another mission. This is destiny." "Destiny," Lira repeated with a snort. The idea was laughable to her. Destiny in a universe as unforgiving as theirs. "I'm not buying into any mystical nonsense." She pushed the chip back toward him. "You want to sell me on this, you better come up with something real. I don't do fairy tales." Kaiden's lips curled into a thin smile, as if her rejection amused him. "It's not a fairy tale. It's survival," he whispered, leaning forward so that his eyes seemed to pierce through her. "And you, Lira, are running out of time." For a moment, silence enveloped the table. Bronn shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension between them. Lyra's cybernetic eye flickered, scanning the mysterious stranger for any hidden weapons or devices. Nothing. She had met too many people like Kaiden, calculated, secretive, dangerous. But there was something about him that felt different, something that tugged at her instincts. "Fine," she finally said, pocketing the chip. "But if this goes sideways, you won't live to regret it." Kaiden straightened, a small glimmer of approval in his otherwise cold demeanor. "I wouldn't expect anything less," he said. Without another word, he turned and exited the cantina, his long coat sweeping behind him. Lira watched him leave, her mind already racing with questions. "You sure about this?" Bronn asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Phobos isn't exactly the friendliest place." Lyra's gaze hardened. "We've danced with death before, Bronn. What's one more waltz?" The two of them left the cantina shortly after, stepping out into the icy expanse of the asteroid's surface. Their ship, the Vesper, was docked nearby, its sleek black hull blending into the star-studded sky. As they boarded, Lira slid into the pilot's seat, her fingers expertly dancing across the controls. Bronn took the co-pilot's seat, still visibly uneasy. "You think we can trust this Blackwell guy?" he asked, glancing over at her. "Trust?" Lira echoed, her voice bitter. "In this line of work, trust is a luxury we can't afford." The ship's engines roared to life as they lifted off from the asteroid, cutting through the void of space toward Phobos. Lyra's mind raced, contemplating the risks. The last time she'd trusted someone, she barely escaped with her life. Yet something about this mission felt different. There was a sense of inevitability hanging in the air, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. "Whatever's on Phobos," she muttered, "it better be worth the trouble." Hours passed as they sped through the stars, the looming silhouette of Mars growing larger in the viewport. Phobos, the smaller and more treacherous of the Martian moons, hung in the distance, a bleak and desolate rock riddled with ancient scars. "It doesn't look like much," Bronn said, squinting at the view. "But I've heard stories about what's buried beneath the surface." Lira nodded, her focus fixed on the mission ahead. "Let's just hope those stories are wrong." As they approached Phobos, the ship's sensors began to pick up strange readings. "There's some kind of interference," Bronn reported, his fingers flying across the controls. "It's like the whole moon is wrapped in an energy field." Lira frowned, her cybernetic eye scanning the data. "We're going in blind," she said grimly. "Whatever's down there doesn't want us to find it." They touched down on Phobos with a soft thud, the ship's landing gear sinking into the moon's dusty surface. The atmosphere was thin and cold, a perpetual twilight casting long shadows over the barren landscape. Lira and Bronn suited up, their helmets sealing with a hiss as they prepared to venture into the unknown. "Ready?" she asked, her voice crackling through the comms. Bronn nodded, his expression tense. "As I'll ever be." The two of them descended from the ship, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. The air was eerily still, and the only sound was the faint hum of their breathing apparatuses. Lyra's cybernetic eye scanned the horizon, picking up faint traces of movement. "We're not alone," she muttered, her hand instinctively reaching for her blaster. Bronn's grip tightened on his own weapon as they pressed forward, their eyes darting across the landscape. As they moved deeper into the moon's surface, the interference grew stronger, distorting their sensors and scrambling their communications. "Something's messing with our gear," Bronn said, frustration evident in his voice. We should head back to the ship and regroup. But Lira shook her head, her eyes narrowing in determination. No, we came here for a reason, and I'm not leaving empty-handed. They pushed forward, the terrain growing more treacherous with each step. Jagged rocks and deep crevices littered the ground, forcing them to navigate carefully. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the air, causing the ground beneath them to tremble. What the hell was that? Bronn asked, his eyes wide with alarm. Lira didn't respond. She was too busy staring at the object that had just appeared on the horizon, a massive ancient structure, half buried in the dust. The structure was unlike anything Lira had ever seen before. It was composed of dark, weathered stone, with intricate carvings etched into its surface. "That's it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "That's what we came here for." Bronn stared at the structure in disbelief. "You're kidding me, right? We're supposed to break into that thing."
Lira simirket.
"Welcome to Phobos." As they approached the structure, the air around them seemed to hum with energy. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she studied the carvings, trying to decipher their meaning. "This is old," she muttered to herself. "Really old." Bronn glanced around nervously, his hand hovering over his blaster. "I don't like this," he said. "We should get out of here." But Lira ignored him, her eyes locked on the entrance to the structure. The entrance was a large, circular doorway, sealed shut by an ancient mechanism. Lira knelt down, examining the locking mechanism with a critical eye. "This is going to take some time," she said, pulling out her tools. "Keep an eye out." Bronn grumbled under his breath but did as he was told, scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. As Lira worked, the air around them grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble once again. After what felt like an eternity, Lira finally managed to crack the mechanism. With a loud groan, the door slowly creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway leading deep into the heart of the structure. "After you," Bronn said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Lira shot him a glare before stepping inside, her blaster at the ready. The passageway was pitch black, the only light coming from the small glow sticks Lira and Bronn carried. The walls were lined with more carvings, depicting strange, otherworldly creatures and ancient symbols. "This place gives me the creeps," Bronn muttered. Lira ignored him, her focus solely on the path ahead. She had come too far to turn back now. As they ventured deeper into the structure, the air grew thick with tension. Every step they took echoed through the dark, and the carvings on the walls seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. "I don't like this," Bronn repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. But Lira pressed on, her determination unwavering. Whatever was hidden within this ancient structure, she was going to find it. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, they reached a large chamber. At the center of the room stood a massive pedestal, upon which sat a strange, glowing artifact. "That's it," Lira breathed, her eyes wide with awe. "That's what we came for." But as she reached out to grab the artifact, a deep, rumbling voice echoed through the chamber. "You should not have come here." The voice sent chills down Lyra's spine, and she instinctively drew her blaster. But there was no one else in the room. The voice seemed to come from the walls themselves, reverberating through the air like a ghostly whisper. "We need to leave," Bronn said, his voice filled with panic. But Lira shook her head, her eyes locked on the artifact. "Not without this," she said, grabbing the glowing object. The moment Lyra's fingers touched the artifact, the ground beneath them began to shake violently. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, and the carvings on the walls seemed to glow brighter, pulsating with an ominous energy. "Lira, we need to go now," Bronn shouted, his voice barely audible over the rumbling. But Lyra's grip on the artifact tightened. Something about it called to her, like a distant whisper in the back of her mind. With the artifact in hand, Lira turned and sprinted towards the entrance, Bronn hot on her heels. The passageway they had entered through was now collapsing, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling as the entire structure seemed to be coming apart. "We're not going to make it," Bronn yelled, but Lira pushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't going to die here. Not today. Just as they reached the exit, a massive boulder crashed down in front of them, blocking their path. "We're trapped," Bronn shouted, panic rising in his voice. Lyra's mind raced, searching for a way out. Her cybernetic eye scanned the area, and she spotted a small vent in the corner of the room. "This way," she called, pulling Bronn towards the vent. The vent was narrow, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but it was their only option. Lira went first, crawling through the dark, claustrophobic tunnel, the artifact clutched tightly in her hand. Behind her, Bronn followed, his breathing ragged with fear. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, and Lyra's muscles burned with the effort of crawling. But she kept going, the thought of survival driving her forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the tunnel and into the open air. The structure behind them was collapsing in on itself, disappearing into the dust of Phobos. Lira collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. Bronn lay beside her, his chest heaving with exhaustion. "That was too close," he muttered between breaths. Lira didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the artifact in her hand, glowing faintly in the dim light. "What the hell is that thing?" Bronn asked, sitting up and staring at the object in Lyra's hand. Lira shook her head, still trying to catch her breath. "I don't know," she admitted. "But whatever it is, it's powerful. I can feel it." Bronn frowned, his gaze shifting between Lira and the artifact. "We need to get rid of it. This thing. It's dangerous." "No," Lira said firmly, clutching the artifact tighter. "We're keeping it. This could be the key to something bigger than either of us. Something that could change everything." Bronn stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious? After everything that just happened, you want to hold on to that thing? It nearly killed us." But Lyra's mind was already made up. She wasn't going to let go of the artifact, no matter the cost. As they made their way back to the ship, Lira couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The artifact pulsed with a strange energy, and she could feel its presence in the back of her mind, like a distant whisper. "We need to figure out what this thing is," she muttered to herself. Bronn, still skeptical, shook his head. "I've got a bad feeling about this," he said. "This thing. It's not natural." Back on the Vesper, Lira and Bronn set the artifact on a table in the ship's common area. The glowing object seemed to hum with energy, casting a faint light over the room. "I'm going to run a scan," Lira said, pulling out her tools. "Maybe we can figure out what we're dealing with." But as she began to analyze the artifact, something strange happened. The lights on the ship flickered, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "Lira, something's not right," Bronn said, his voice filled with unease. The artifact's glow grew brighter, and a strange, high-pitched noise filled the air. Suddenly, the ship's systems began to fail, one by one. The engines shut down, the lights flickered out, and the control panels went dark. "What the hell is happening?" Lira shouted, her heart racing with fear. The artifact pulsed again, and this time Lira heard a voice she hadn't heard in years. "Lira Valtor," the voice whispered, sending chills down her spine. "You cannot escape your past." Lira froze, her mind racing. The voice, It was familiar. Too familiar. No, she muttered, shaking her head. It's not possible. But the voice continued, louder this time. You know what you must do, Lira. You know where this leads. Lyra's hands trembled as she stared at the artifact, the memories flooding back. She had heard that voice before, long ago, in a life she had tried to forget. Bronn, we need to destroy this thing, she said, her voice filled with urgency. But before Bronn could respond, the artifact emitted a blinding flash of light, and everything went dark. When Lira opened her eyes, she found herself standing in a vast, empty expanse. The stars above her twinkled in the black void, and the ground beneath her feet was cold and barren. Where am I? She whispered, her voice echoing in the emptiness. A figure appeared in the distance, walking towards her. As it drew closer, Lyra's heart sank. It was Kaiden Blackwell. Welcome, Lira, Kaiden said, his voice calm and steady. You found the truth at last. Lyra's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. What is this place? What's going on? Kaiden smiled, a cold, knowing smile. This is where it all ends, he said. You see, Lira, the artifact wasn't just a relic. It was a key to a prison. A prison, Lira repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. What are you talking about? Kaiden's expression darkened, and he took a step closer. You and I, Lira. We've been here before. In another life. Another time. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her. No. That's not possible. Kaiden nodded, his gaze unflinching. You don't remember, do you? The artifact brought you back here. Back to the beginning. Lyra's mind spun with confusion and fear. But how? She stammered. Kaiden smiled again. His eyes filled with a dark, haunting knowledge. Because, Lira, he whispered, you were never meant to escape. As the truth settled in, Lyra's memories flooded back. She had been here before, trapped in this endless cycle, forced to relive the same events over and over. The artifact wasn't a key to freedom, it was a key to her prison. And Kaiden, he had been the one keeping her there every time. No, Lira screamed, her voice echoing through the void. But it was too late. The cycle had begun again. But tell me, did you like this story? Would you change anything? Would you like a sequel? Leave it in the comments, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and leave your like. And for more stories like this, click on the video that appears on the screen.